Right, as Sarah announced, I'm going to tell you a little bit about, food and nutrition and how this impacts on our cognitive performance. So we just heard that we hear with our brain, which is interesting. So not only with our ears. And, it's quite, we kind of know that we think with our brain. And what I want to talk about is really the connection between nutrition and brain health. So at the moment, it's a hot topic, really, looking at nutrition. And in general, we already looked at it very much in terms of more general health, focus on conditions such as obesity, cardiovascular disease, and also diabetes. Now, one of the things where there's a more recent focus, and which I'm particularly interested in, is really the effect of nutrition on cognitive performance, on thinking, and also on our general well-being and mood. Now, what can we do? Why is nutrition important in terms of health and also cognitive performance? Well, really, when we look at the different stages in life, then in our early life, we need to have optimal nutrition to ensure growth and development. In adult life, what we can do is we can ensure the highest possible function, but then things we do in adult life and also in early life will determine to a certain extent how we age. And what we want to do with optimal nutrition is really to make sure we maintain the highest level of function and also prevent disease. Now, going back to the brain, so we heard about the brain and cognitive function, and in terms of the fuel our brain needs, it's a right fuel guzzler. So it's not very kind of fuel, well, it is probably efficient, but it needs a lot of it. And compared to the rest of the body, so below the neck, actually it's quite a disproportionate energy requirement that the brain needs. And the two major sources of energy for the brain is glucose, which is a sugar, and oxygen. So the energy needs of the brain also change slightly across the lifespan. So we can see here on the left side, the developing brain, and the amount of glucose the brain needs for optimal functioning. So that's very high at certain ages, and that's makes sense because it's a time of neuronal development, it's a time of intense learning, and then the metabolic rate goes slightly down across age. So what we definitely can see is carbohydrates, glucose, and sugars are very important for our brain. Now we take these sugars in through our diet. If we eat carbohydrates, they pass through the intestines, they're converted to glucose, and that is then absorbed into our bloodstream. And obviously, as the brain needs glucose, it's important to have the ability for the sugar to actually reach the brain. And indeed, these sugars cross the blood-brain barrier, so they go straight into the brain. Now, another thing that's important to mention here, and we will see why this is important a little bit later, is that our body has a relatively good mechanism to control the sugar levels in our blood and in our cells, because obviously we know it's a very important energy resource. So if we have high blood sugar level, if we eat something, then we will release insulin, and insulin then makes sure that the glucose is taken up into the cells. And if we have low sugar levels, then again, we have internal mechanisms that enable our bodies to release energy, release sugars that have been stored before, again, to make sure that we are not running too low. Now, this is all good, but the problem at the moment is that we've seen a very dramatic increase in the consumption of sugar-sweetened soft drinks and also added sugars in our diets in other foods. Now, going back to soft drinks, it's actually one of the major contributors to our daily energy intake. Now, there is a clear kind of, appeal towards sugary foods. And that's one of them, is because they tend to taste really nice. And then there's marketing involved as well, particularly when we look at snacking, when we look at energy drinks, where we kind of assume they combat fatigue, they increase our energy, and they might actually make us feel a little bit, euphoric, some kind of minor euphoric feeling. Now, the work we've done in my lab is really looking at the effects of sugars on cognitive function and behavior. We wanted to understand what sugars and carbohydrates actually affect, which aspects of cognitive performance and mood they affect. And we were working together with industry really to produce healthier choices. Now, it's always difficult to think about healthy nutrition, healthier choices, and ideal case scenario, you want to go in a shop and you want to know everything I buy is relatively healthy. Now, this isn't probably going to be like this for a long time, if ever. But if we can actually make sure that most of the products in the aisles are, healthy, and we help the consumer to make healthier choices simply by changing the products, then that's obviously a good thing. Now, the way we did that is fairly simple. In order to assess the effects on sugar, on brain function, and on cognitive performance and mood, we have volunteers who are given drinks that contain sugar or a placebo. And then we assess their cognitive performance, memory tasks, and also assess how they're feeling. In terms of when we think about cognition, well, what is it? Well, we have different aspects of or components of cognition that we looked at. So there's memory, for example, there's executive function. So executive function involves planning. It makes sure that you pay your taxes. It makes sure that you do certain things. It inhibits certain behavioral propensities as well. For example, maybe not telling your boss all the time what you really think of him or her. It's also attention, reaction time. So it's kind of pressing a button. How fast can you press a button? And so on. So there are various aspects of cognitive function we can look at. Now, what we found was, unsurprisingly, if we give folk a sugary drink, then their glucose levels rise and their insulin levels rise as well, because we need insulin to make sure that the sugar is actually used by our cells. What we found, what is perhaps a bit more interesting, is that we can affect cognitive performance. And so it depends on the amount of sugar we give to people. So here we have the placebo drink, so that doesn't contain any sugar. It tastes sweet as well, so there's sweetness matched, but it doesn't actually contain any sugar. And then we have here, for example, a drink that contains 25 grams of glucose. And this is based on a memory task where people actually remember more stuff after they've had the sugary drink. So having done a number of years of these studies, what we found is memory seems to be particularly susceptible to these changes in sugar level, attention as well to a certain extent, and executive functioning. So knowing certain behavioral tasks, so knowing which aspect of memory is affected, we can then kind of start thinking about, okay, where in the brain are these cognitive functions actually located? And what we can see is we have memory is particular hippocampal, medial, temporal lobe. We also have executive function, which is situated in the frontal lobe. So what this location then can tell us is maybe a little bit about the energy needs of these specific areas. So when we look at memories, it might have something to do with a mechanism that's actually part of our evolutionary system to allow us to remember important information. Okay, so think about evolutionary stuff that if I go to this watering hole, I should probably remember there's a massive lion there and maybe not go there again. Now, the reason why we remember certain very salient, important events is because an area of the brain as well, the amygdala and the hippocampus, the memory areas, are working together. What the stress situation that is created by this tiger or whatever it is we have a rise in our stress hormones, and this rise in stress hormones also leads to a kind of increase in glucose, in sugar levels. So it could be that we are kind of programmed to react to these spikes in sugar levels because from an evolutionary point of view, that has something to do with stress and memory of stressful events. When we look at the frontal lobes, then it could be that here we have an area of the brain that is developing very late in our lifespan, but also from an evolutionary point of view, developed quite late. And it might be the case that this one is actually quite energy demanding compared to some other areas of the brain. So from this, we would say, well, that's great. I'm just going to have loads of sugar now because I will remember everything and I will do my taxes on time and so on. Now, unfortunately, there are two sides of the coin, and that's because we have our own homeostatic mechanisms. We have mechanisms that try to balance when certain amounts of, for example, sugar are too high. Now, what a continuous feeding of our body with high amounts of sugar leads to is high amounts of insulin are released, and eventually we can get insulin resistance where our cells actually don't react very well to the insulin anymore. We get metabolic syndrome, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. So not good news. So even though in the short term, there are some benefits, in the longer term, this kind of feeding of sugar at a kind of permanent level isn't a very good idea. So is sugar now the devil and the culprit for all kind of bad things that ever happened to the human species? When you look at the internet, then it seems to be the case, or some of the stories seem to suggest that, we should avoid sugar at all costs. Now, but that's not quite the full story, because really the devil is in the detail. And what we can take away from some of the research we've done is that what we know is a much better kind of profile in terms of providing our bodies with the necessary sugars they need is to have a kind of avoid these spikes we get from drinking high sugary drinks, high sugary foods, and to make sure we have a kind of relatively stable glucose level or blood sugar level across the day. And we can do that by, for example, using sugars that are slow release sugars, such as, for example, isomaltulose, which some products now are sweetened with. We can also alter the kind of glycemic response, the way our body's glucose, the way glucose goes into our body, by adding fiber and protein to products. So to kind of add stuff to the products that actually then changes the rate of the degradation and also the slowing of the glycemic response. So what about the whole notion that, well, actually, I like eating sugary foods because they make me feel good? And also, what about the whole sugar rush? Well, it does make me really, it makes children go completely berserk, but also in terms of our adding energy, we feel more alert. So just looking at some of these kind of myths that are hanging around, well, carbohydrates and mood, it was always assumed that because carbohydrates are actually the building block of one chemical that we know is the kind of feel-good chemical in the brain, and that's serotonin. So you would think, eating carbohydrate-rich food could actually make you feel, very, very good. Now, there is very limited evidence that this is actually the case. Yes, sometimes carbohydrate-rich food can make you feel good because any kind of food that tastes nice targets areas of the brain that are also targeted by substances that can make us feel high and good, such as drugs. Now, obviously, the kind of area, the activation in the brain area isn't the same towards food as we get towards drug, but it's the area of the brain that makes us feel good and that is kind of rewarding, where eating certain stuff is rewarding. Now, we have actually looked at the effects of carbohydrates on mood and looking at a number of studies. So we did a meta-analysis where rather than looking at kind of one or two studies, you look at a number of studies and you look at the overall effect you find from a whole host of studies. We found that sugars and carbohydrates are actually associated with feeling more tired and less alert shortly after you've had them. So the notion of I have a sugary snack or I have a sugary drink in the afternoon to kind of perk me up doesn't really work. And again, the way towards maintaining performance, maintaining mood, maintaining energy levels across the day seems to be foods that have a slow release of glucose into the bloodstream and that keep our blood glucose levels stable. Recommendations. I know you probably want to know, so what about GI, glycemic index foods? Well, yes, but the problem is that a high GI food, for example, can actually be changed into a low GI food and a slow release food by simply adding some other stuff which you eat at the same time. So I can think that the only recommendation we can make at this point is reduce your free sugar intake. Make sure you eat carbohydrates that are slow release. So in some ways, go with a kind of low glycemic index food and increase the consumptions of foods that are rich in fiber. Okay, and that's it. And thank you very much for listening. And any questions, I believe you can just message.